Welcome back, and thank you for choosing to spend some of your precious time on the Modern Pain Podcast. You will not be disappointed this week as we have another great guest, Mike Stewart. Mike is someone who is well known in the pain world and has published a bit on communication and clinical practice, and specifically he's published a bit around the use of metaphor. This week we're going to talk about Mike's journey and the complexities of pain education. We discussed the transition Mike, like all of us, made from how he was taught to communicate in university to what's best to communicate and connect with a patient who's dealing with some complex pain issues. The use of metaphor is a topic we touch on, and Mike also shares some clinical exercises he uses with patients on the podcast. You're going to be a better communicator after this episode. We have Mike's website and courses in the description. Make sure you check out some of his great course offerings. You won't be disappointed. Enjoy the episode.
This is the Modern Pain Podcast with Mark Cardula.
Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. It's been a long time coming. I've been a fan of your work. I've read quite a bit of it, and really hits home for a lot of my biases of where I like to kind of help our students at our university, but also when I do some teaching as well, of helping communication and helping our folks better be able to communicate and kind of connect with folks in pain. Because I think, and we'll talk about it this episode, as far as kind of how we're all trained as physios and then how the real world of the clinic kind of demands maybe a different style of communication. But before we get into that, Mike, I'd love if you can give folks a little bit of introduction to yourself. Most folks, I'm sure, know of you, but I'd love if you could kind of introduce yourself, where you're at and what you're up to.
Yeah, sure. Well, likewise, Mark. I'm a huge fan of this podcast. I recently listened to Bronnie Thompson's episode that you recorded. I'm an original founder member of the Bronnie Thompson Appreciation Society. I love what Bronnie does. So it was fabulous to hear her speak. And I think you're doing great work, and I hope you keep it up for many years to come. So what do? I've got three jobs. I'm a clinician, so I'm a physiotherapist. I'm one of these weird people, and I seem to, whenever I teach around the world, I meet lots of other weird people like me. I knew I wanted to be a physiotherapist from about the age of 14. So I was sort of very certain. I'm a twin. My twin brother, we're now 48 years of age. He still doesn't really know what he wants to do. But I've always been really sort of dead sure about what it is I wanted to do. So I've been a physio. I was lucky enough to fulfill my ambition of becoming a physio. I've been a physio now for almost 30 years. I find my job still absolutely fascinating, listening to the stories that people share with us. And I find physios become far more fun as the years have gone by, because it allows us to be more creative and to be more human. And maybe we'll talk about how, initially my physiotherapy training was quite robotic and quite formulaic, quite recipe-based, and I found that very dull, really. So that's my first job as a clinician. My second job is in research. We'll touch on some of the research that I look at, particularly looking at how we can help people develop their communication skills, their teaching skills. Most importantly, how can we help people in pain express their experience? Pain is pretty hard to talk about, so I teach practical skills in how we can get better at doing that, at empowering patients to express their experience. And my third job is teaching. So I teach no pain courses around the world. I've taught in 19 different countries. And if you think that pain and communication and education are weird and complex, try going to 19 different countries and you suddenly realize that it gets even more complex. It changes with every culture. It changes with every time zone. So I find it eternally fascinating.
Yeah, that must be a fascinating experience just to be able to travel to different cultures. I know just my limited, I haven't had 19 countries worth of exposure, but just talking to other folks digitally about it and how different countries, cultures look at pain and communicate it and all these things. So obviously a lot of nuance there to be had when you're trying to get really to the physios and folks in there. Yeah.
I taught a course years ago in Qatar, and there was the whole room. We just went through, where are you all from? And they were from places that, I've never taught in, Central Africa and, all over the place, and in the Middle East. And we just had a huge discussion of, well, what is physiotherapy where you live? And it's really interesting to discuss the differences that we see with physio around the world, and the challenges that we face are actually not that dissimilar.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You had spoke to it, and I want to kind of dig into it a little deeper as far as that initial training in physio school, because it's a common thing we discuss as far as how we're trained to communicate, that whole normative, like you said, robotic style of communication. And then we get to the clinic, and that communication style doesn't necessarily always not work, but it definitely is limited when we're dealing with complexity of pain and just unique people. So I'm just curious, I'd love to hear, and I think the audience would benefit hearing your journey from like where you feel like that, where you started with that robotic communication and how it kind of evolved over time to where it is today.
Yeah. Well, I look back now and I cringe. I think, you have to sort of reflect. We don't learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on experience. And if I sit and reflect on my experience, I cringe at how I used to introduce myself to patients in clinic. It would almost be a script. It would be a case of, oh, hi, good morning. I'm Mike Stewart. I'm your physio. Today, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through lots of questions. It helps my brain work out what's going on. There'll be time for you to ask questions after I've been through the process. So it's all about me. It's very didactic, very paternalistic, very clinician-led. And this is what the evidence shows, that healthcare communication is very much led by the clinician. The poor patient is coming along as a passive recipient of our information. So we weren't really ever trained to guide people. We were trained to tell people what to do, and this is a central problem. Is a psychologist I work with always says, if you're talking more than the patient, there's something wrong. Because if you look at anybody's face, or most people's face, nature is trying to tell you something. The universe is trying to tell you something. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So the answers to people's problems lie in their words and their thoughts, and as we'll maybe touch on, their metaphors, not ours. So I think this problem where we have this process where we do, one of my patients called it tick boxology. We ask all the questions. It's our process. It's not about the patient. It's about us. It leads to some issues. I think it leads to burnout. I've been teaching courses in burnout. I think it's one of the leading factors. We know in healthcare post-COVID, healthcare professionals are burning out 3 times more likely to burn out than other professions. And one of the reasons is because we're working too hard. We're not allowing our patients to work hard enough. We're not allowing them to take control. And we're doing everything. We're going, let me do everything for you, and let me take you through this process. So, the process has gone from very much me having the steering wheel. I often think, how can we learn from other professions? And I think one of the professions that we can learn most from, if we're thinking about how we can communicate and empower patients, are driving instructors. Let me try something with you now, Mark. I do this with patients. Do you drive a car?
I do.
How long have you been driving for?
28. I was a little off on my math. Okay, somewhere in that ballpark.
So 28 years. So this you can do this with patients. It involves 3 questions. The first is, how long have you been driving? 28 years. The second question is, how many lessons did you have when you were learning how to drive? How many lessons did you have with the driving instructor?
With my driving instructor, gosh, we only did probably there was 2 weeks where we were in the driving instructor, probably 2 times, 2 big times. And then it was a lot with family and friends family had to take you out a bit.
Perfect. Okay. So since you passed your test 28 years ago, how many times have you seen the driving instructor? How many times have you needed somebody in the passenger seat to tell you what to do?
Besides my wife telling me how to drive, probably I have not had any driving instructors.
So then if you're my patient now, I would now ask you a question, which of course is, well, why? Why don't you need the driving instructor? Why don't you need somebody else in the car guiding you and telling you what to do?
Yeah, because I know how to drive. It's been something I've done my whole life. It's nothing that I need to be re-instructed on.
That's exactly it. And that, I think, is a central dilemma in healthcare, not just physiotherapy, but healthcare in general. We could learn from driving instructors. They literally give the student the wheel, the controls, so it's about us. If we're going to empower somebody else, we have to be prepared to lose some of our power. Our power has to go down in order for their power to rise up. And I sometimes wonder whether, I've seen patients who've spent years and lots of money, and they're essentially either in the back seat of the vehicle, they're being chauffeured around. The clinician is sort of seeing them 3 or 4 times a week. They're doing everything. And their communication style is very much that they're in control. The patient just comes in passively as a recipient and lies down whilst they talk about where they're going on holiday or whatever. Some patients I've even seen, and when we do this metaphor with patients, some patients will even say, well, I'm not in the back seat. I'm in the trunk. I'm in the boot. I'm locked in the boot. I've been there for years, and I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not going where I want to go. So I think this sort of central dilemma that we see in healthcare is a crucial thing to address. We need to become more like driving instructors and less like chauffeurs. And that is a central part of shifting the communication style to let them come up with the answers.
What do you think that's a symptom of? I think, I just look back and I personally myself, I think there was this pressure to be the authority, to feel like all this work in physio school. And I definitely see that symptom in healthcare. And I've thankfully through you and I'm also part of the Bronnie Thompson Appreciation Society, where having that ability to kind of suspend, I don't want to say suspend the power, but to humble myself to be eye to eye and like equal expertise, shared expertise in the situation. Why do you think it's so hard for clinicians to make that transition? Is it just a discomfort and destabilizing experience that they have with it? Or what do you think is behind that?
It's a great question. I think, it's a complex answer that I would give. I think it's multifactorial. I think for some people, it's about ego. We have to be honest. Some clinicians have an ego that they want to maintain. So they have the answers. They're the expert. For others, it's a fear of, is this what the patient expects? The patient expects me to be the expert. So, what if I start asking them? I often say to my patients I'm working with, Socrates once said, to find yourself, you have to think for yourself. I've got to get you to think. I've got to get you to come up with things. I often also use, there's a really interesting TED talk. Some of you might have seen it, but Ernesto Ciroli, who is an Italian aid worker, he did a TED talk called "Do You Want to Help Someone? Shut Up and Listen." And in it, he talks about how him and his colleagues flew out to Milan, from Milan to Africa to save people's lives. There was starvation, there was malnutrition. When they arrived, they found that the ground was quite fertile, so they set about doing what Italians do best. They taught the locals how to grow tomatoes. Italians are great at growing tomatoes. So they went through this process. The locals sort of tended to the fields, grew the tomatoes. The tomatoes got produced. Ciroli and his colleagues were about to fly back to Milan, patting themselves on the back, clinking beers together, going, didn't we do a fantastic job? We've saved lives. Then overnight, just before they flew home, an enormous herd of hippos came along and ate every single tomato in sight. And of course, the locals, Ciroli said to the locals, why did you not tell us about the hippos? And they said, well, you never asked. And this is a crucial lesson. And I think it comes to answer the question. One of the reasons why we don't give the patients the steering wheel is we think that we have the answers. Dempster and colleagues found that physiotherapists need to shift from a fix it mindset to a sit with it mindset. So instead of trying to fix problems like it's a motor car and you're a mechanic, you're going to sit with it. Like, well, this is a human with a distressing problem. How do we get you to sit with it? So we need to think about, I think there's 3 steps to how we get better at this. Rather than thinking we have the answers and the solutions and coming in like a superhero trying to fix people's problems, we maybe need to think about a simple 3-step process. Listen, 2 ears, 1 mouth again. They have the answers, not you. We've got to draw those answers out from them rather than pouring them in from our brains to theirs. So if we listen, you can then do the second thing, which is to find out what they need. You can only find out what people need if you've listened in the first place. So listen, find out what they need, and then guide them. Act like a signposter, act like a guider. My master's degree was in education, and I found that since that process of developing educational skills, if you follow that 3-step process of listen, find out what they need, guide them. Okay, I've heard what you've said. It sounds like you need these things. Can I maybe direct you to this? How do you like to learn? Do you like to watch things or listen to things or read things? Let me give you some ideas, some pointers, and then let's go from there. I think that's a much better way to do things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you mentioned earlier about how like the clinic's so much more fun these days. And I find it very similar with utilizing this communication style where it's not this, like you said, robotic, kind of scripted. I repeat the same thing over and over again. I mean, that's a quick track to burnout. And now you get like unique people where, obviously you get to listen to unique stories every time somebody comes in. It's a different person who's always going to have a different story. They're going to have different wants, different needs, different lives. And then the unique challenge to kind of fit, how do I fit myself to that unique story and that unique person? Is that kind of what you feel is behind some of the being creative and being able to kind of fit yourself to each unique person where that fun of clinic has come back for you?
Hugely. I think creativity is sadly lacking in healthcare, and I find that it's sadly lacking in education. Sir Ken Robinson did some work as an educator, and he argues that education kills creativity. We all as kids, if you think about when you or any of you've got kids, or when you were a kid, you're really creative. You're really divergent in your thinking. When I work with kids as patients, they'll create their own exercises, the dog, the badger, the frog, whatever they want to do. You try getting a 48-year-old male to do that. That's a really difficult thing to do. So I think we have to be playful. Einstein understood this. I love the quote by Einstein where he says, combinatory play seems to be the essential feature of productive thought. So let's unpack that. Combinatory play, playing with one thing as another thing, is an essential feature of productive thought. So this is crucial because we have to try to get people to be playful, to think differently. And I'm always a firm believer that if you're going to try something creative and playful with patients, you have to maybe begin with a question. To try and invite yourself in a little bit, to try and pique curiosity, which is a simple question. Do you mind if we try something? So if you're going to do something a bit weird, an experiment, a game, I teach lots of sort of experiential learning, teaching people through experience rather than just pouring information in. If you're going to teach people by experience, you've got to check with them. Do you mind if we try something? Can we do something a little weird or something a bit playful? Something a bit different, because this is the one thing we find is that patients have often tried lots of things already and they've found that they've not worked, or they've been a very short-term quick fix. So they're looking for something new. They're looking for something different.
Yeah. And you mentioned some of your creativity when you discussed how do you like to learn as a patient, which isn't a common question I think you hear posed by physiotherapists, healthcare in general, for that matter. I'm curious how you leverage that type of thought process with your patients, because obviously there are different ways patients do that. But I'm just curious, like maybe if you can give some examples of how you would approach that in clinic.
Yeah, I think, it's really important. In education these days, you're not allowed to use the word homework. Homework, I always find it quite amusing, but homework is often seen in educational terms as a sort of negative, pessimistic sort of term. It has connotations with sitting at home doing lots of work as a kid. So blended learning is the sort of the new version of homework in a sense. But blended learning, as a clinician, it's a really crucial idea because we don't have a great deal of time with our patients in clinic. So it begins with a recognition that we have to provide them with things to do and things to look at. So a simple question is, how do you like to learn best? Do you like to read? Do you like to watch? Do you like to listen to things? I can therefore direct you towards, here's a podcast to listen to, here's a video to watch on TED or on YouTube, here's an article to read perhaps, here's a booklet to read. So we're trying to tailor it towards their preference, what they prefer to do in terms of learning. And then I think what I tend to do, and it can be quite helpful, is ask them to write down a list of two things. So I always ask them two questions, and I send them away. If I've given them a podcast or a video to watch on TED, I'll say, what made sense? Next time you come in, I want to know what made sense when you went through that learning experience, and what didn't make sense. And then I can base where we go next in guiding you. Remember, listen, find out what they need, guide. I can guide them based on, well, this made sense, but I didn't really get this bit and I didn't understand this. Okay, well, what can help you make sense of that? So it's a constant ongoing journey of discovery for them.
Yeah. And with that, we're obviously doing a bit of teaching and coaching of our patients, and I know you're conscious of those activities. It's not just, I'm a teacher and a coach. You actually think of like teaching skills and coaching skills. I'm curious, like, if you can kind of unpack that a little bit as far as how conscious you are and how deep do you go as far as like, the whole methods of how you're teaching and, different ways of coaching. I'm just curious how conscious that is in your practice.
It's now sort of almost underneath the surface. It's sort of an integral part of what I do, and people who I train get to the point where they say the same thing. It's just one way to look at it is, I often think that when we're training as clinicians, the traditional sort of biomedical training as clinicians is that what distinguishes us from somebody on the street without any training in anatomy is we have an understanding of what's going on underneath here. I know brachioradialis, I know the olecranon fossa. I've learned what's going on under the surface in terms of anatomy and biomechanics and physiology. But with regards to education, teaching patients things, which we do every day, teaching them how to do an exercise, how to use a walking stick, or more complex sort of understandings about pain, perhaps. We teach people all day, every day. Education is a huge part of what we do, but we don't learn what's underneath the skin. We don't learn the anatomy of learning. So we don't have a sense of what's going on. We often teach people based on what we presume is good education. So this is a huge problem, because education, what we see with education is that we often see it as we pour in our information. We load their brains with our knowledge, as we've already highlighted. But education comes from a Latin word, educare, which means to draw out things from within. So we're constantly trying to draw out experiences from patients, which comes back to the idea of changing the way that you see communication. But there's other things too, like how many times do we see patients who they seem to be blocked, they seem to be stuck? You see a face that's like this. What? I don't understand what you're talking about. Or they get angry. I've seen 15 different clinicians over the last 20 years. None of them know what they're talking about. They all have a different version of what's going on. All of the answers to these problems, to these challenges, lie in understanding what's happening under the hood of education, under the skin. So, how do we understand learning blocks? How do we unblock people who are blocked? So I think a large part of my job is to teach people the anatomy of learning, so they understand why certain things are not maybe going as well as they could be when they're trying to help their patients.
Yeah, it seems like that would be very helpful as far as not just like, well, this ain't working, let me just take a U-turn and go in a different direction, where you kind of unpack that a little bit, have some understandings of what might be going on. That could be ways you can take that education and make it successful versus just like running your head against the wall and not having some strategies to kind of better understand it.
It's an assumed skill. We assume that, because we've got a mouth and ears, that we can communicate and we can educate. And they're often termed as soft skills. They're anything but soft. They're hard, they're complex. And I think understanding these, accepting and acknowledging that maybe these skills, one way to look at it is, if you have kids, most people don't send their kids to a school to be taught by people who don't have educational skills. This is a profession. Teaching is a profession. These people understand what education is and what education isn't. I find it fascinating whenever I have patients who are educators. They've been teachers throughout their whole career. I saw a lady recently, she's retired. She'd been a headmistress in schools for years. And she was telling me about her previous experiences with other physiotherapists. And she was being quite critical, because she said, this is just terrible education. They literally gave me some exercises and said, well, these will be simple, try them. There's an assumption. And this is, again, one of the crucial problems, is if you haven't been trained in educational skills, you, without realizing, get this dynamic between how much you challenge someone and how much you support someone wrong. So if you challenge somebody way too much and you don't support them anywhere near enough, they bail, they go somewhere else. That might be that time where the patient they don't come back to see you again, and you're scratching your head thinking, what happened to that patient? Maybe you, without realizing, without the skills, maybe you challenged them way too much and you didn't support them enough. But it goes the opposite way. Sometimes, we'll see the patient who's 85 years of age. They remind you of their grandmother. You don't want to challenge them very much. You want to maybe give them a cuddle. So you support them too much and you don't challenge them enough. So again, understanding the dynamics between how much we challenge, how much we support, that understanding that shift, that this is a crucial skill to develop as a clinician.
Yeah, and I'm not sure it's one that explicitly clinicians even somewhat consider. I think there's just this is the way I support or don't support or just kind of educate. So yeah, it's great to have that kind of explicit understanding, or at least that explicit thought process that's going on in your head of kind of how much or how much little, how little support should I be offering to let this person obviously point towards their goals, point toward what's important to them in life. I'd like to talk a little bit, because I know you've done a lot of writing and work on the use of metaphor in practice. Obviously, it's one way we like to communicate some of these complex topics and things like that. And in some of the articles, and we'll link them in the show notes to this, you point out there's some metaphors that are helpful and maybe some less helpful. I'm wondering if you can kind of unpack your work a little bit around metaphor and kind of what you see with the use of that in clinical practice.
Yeah, I've always been somebody who I'm quite consciously aware that as a clinician throughout my career, I've always used metaphor, and I started years ago to look into, well, why do I use metaphor, and why do other clinicians use metaphor, and are they helpful? And what I discovered is that there's a lot of opinionated research that's been done over the last 30, 40 years. Susan Sontag was one of the first people to look at this. But it's very opinion-based. There's sort of two camps. One that says metaphors are crucial. We must use them, when we're trying to make sense of abstract scientific ideas like pain science. You have to use metaphors to help them understand. But there's another school of thought, which are also right, which is metaphors are unhelpful. We shouldn't use metaphors. They can be harmful. Sontag started with this idea that, cancer being a fight is a problem, because what if you're not strong enough to fight the fight? Or painkillers, the idea of killing pain, So some metaphors can be very reductionistic and problematic. For example, I have a colleague, a friend who's a cardiologist. He always says to me, I hate it when I see plumbers, when my patients are plumbers, they come in and they'll say, fix my pump. I fix pumps every day in my job as a plumber, fix my heart pump. And we see, I see people who work in IT and computing, and they'll say, well, my nervous system's like a computer, fix the computer. So metaphors can be seductively reductionistic. They can be really, we go down to the base level. And I did a systematic review with a colleague of mine, Sarah Jane Ryan, and we asked the question, which is, do metaphors provide therapeutic value for people in pain? And the answer is yes and no. We found 4 really positive themes of helping people to connect and express and understand and move forward. But we also found sort of some negative ideas where they can get very frightened by the metaphors that we use. I think that the central thing to remember with a metaphor and how I've shifted in my thinking is I think I've moved as a clinician and as an educator from somebody who teaches ways that we as clinicians can help patients via our metaphors. Pain works like this, the nervous system's like an alarm system, or, we can think of our own. I'm sure you've got lots of people who'll have their own metaphors, which can be great. But there's a central problem, which is, of course, the answers to people's problems lie in their metaphors, their words, their thoughts, not ours. So metaphors act as a safe bridge. Things that people find too distressing to talk about literally, they will say as a metaphor. Or they'll draw as a metaphor. Let me give you an example. We're talking about creativity and the importance of listening to people. One of the weird things that I do with patients, that idea of, do you mind if we try something? One of the weird things that we do with people is we get them to see a problem with communication. We could try it now, Mark. If I get you to touch the end of your nose, and just sort of lightly touch the end of your nose, and then if you were to think about writing down 2 words to describe that experience, if you wrote down the first 2 words that come into mind, you can do that. That's sort of part one of this game. But if I asked you now, instead of writing down 2 words to describe how the end of your nose feels, and instead draw something, if you were to draw what that experience looked like, what you discover is that some people find that they can't write 2 words. It's very limited. Just like with pain, they can't go, well, it's sharp and it's achy and it's throbbing and it's burning. The 2-word thing limits you with a human experience of touch or taste. You can do it with taste with people. But they can suddenly do it in a different way if they draw their experience. So we ask patients to draw, well, okay, if you found it easier to draw what your nose felt like in a doodle, like a kid would draw at kindergarten, then maybe you could draw what your pain looks like. And we get patients who, they'll draw things and then they can suddenly talk. They find this sort of means of expression, this safe bridge, things that they couldn't talk about previously. Now, all of a sudden, it's there, it's open to them. So I think that's a crucial thing to consider is metaphors can be very helpful, but their metaphors, the patient metaphors, are crucial because they allow them to communicate something that's taking place behind the window, behind the curtain. You get to see that safe bridge way of communicating.
No, and I like that too. I think the ability, and I've definitely experienced this in clinic where, you're asking patients to kind of describe their experience and they kind of come up with like this blank. And I've never tried the drawing exercise. I'll have to do that too. And seeing that it could kind of open some doors for some people to express some things that maybe that was just an unlock for them to be able to kind of tap into a little bit more of the experience of what they're dealing with. So, that's great.
Yeah, there's so many, not just the drawing, but, we get patients sometimes if the drawing doesn't work, we'll go, well, okay, look, here's another weird question, to try and draw out people's metaphors, their safe bridge. We sometimes say to people, well, if your pain was a song, what would it be? And people always go, that's a weird question, but then it's maybe not so weird. Most people have a song that links to their life experience, a song that relates to a wedding or a bereavement or a holiday when they're a kid. Joni Mitchell said song lyrics are like tattoos. Their song lyrics are metaphoric. They stick with you. So we do this all the time. We have patients who they come back and they say, well, this is the song that I've chosen. I've gone away and I've thought about it. Here's my song. And then you can unpack that song. What do you mean by these lyrics? And it allows the patient to talk. It allows them to express, to communicate. It makes life much easier for us, and it makes life much easier for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm wondering what your experience has been with some of the unhelpful metaphors out there. I recount back to like Tom Bowen's a friend. He's a patient, chronicpainchampions.com. He's doing some good work for the advocacy front for patients, but I remember discussing on our podcast, and I've definitely seen this in clinical practice where some of these patients come in with this, I'm a chronic pain warrior, where it's this battle, this fight, and this different thing. And I would tend to agree from my experience. I don't always think that metaphor is a helpful one for someone trying, because it almost is just like they're just continuing the tug of war and the pull on that rope with pain. And while life maybe kind of is not where they want it to be, what are your thoughts on those type of metaphors, and what are some ways maybe you've helped patients maybe examine those metaphors and maybe their utility in their pursuits of obviously goals?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, that's a central one, as you've highlighted, that idea of the body as a machine. And we see this a lot. I work within the military and within professional sport, having done some work with the Olympic Committee. And one thing that you see, particularly within those sort of areas, is this idea that the player, the athlete, the soldier is an expensive piece of machinery. And if that expensive piece of machinery is broken, productivity is lower. If the football player is not able to perform, productivity is lower. And we know this from the research that athletes and footballers and players, they're seen as less than human, which is a huge problem. So I think the answer to the question, if you've got somebody who does perceive themselves as a machine, then again, it comes back to using experience. Well, okay, when you do the 400 press-ups, What's the reaction? How does your body respond? And helping them via the experience they're having. Well, I end up in bed for 3 days and everything's in spasm. Then this is a huge problem. And maybe, again, if we're thinking about metaphors, one of the metaphors I use in that situation to help people shift their understanding is, again, we can begin with a question. Metaphors always start with a question because you're trying to get people to really examine an experience in their life. Do you have kids, Mark?
Yes, one daughter.
One daughter. How old's your daughter?
6.
6. Okay. Imagine back to when your daughter was like 3, 4, and she's walking around, and maybe she's off and she goes running ahead of you, and she goes running towards a road, and there's a big truck in the road. What do you as a parent do in that situation?
Probably yell and sprint after her.
Yeah, and you grab her. You do this. I'm a twin. Yeah. My mum and dad had 2 sets of twins. So when we look back at family photos, it was like husky training. There's 4 kids literally on reins. I don't know whether legally you're allowed to use reins these days. I'm not sure. But okay, so my question to you, and this is what I do with a patient, and your listeners can do the same thing. Why would you do this? Why would you sprint after your daughter and stop her from running into the road?
Oh, I want to protect her. I want to make sure she doesn't run out and get hit.
Yeah. Okay. Good answer. But if I'm playing devil's advocate, maybe she won't. Maybe she'll get to the edge of the curb and say, well, okay, this truck looks dangerous. I'm going to stop here at this point. Would you be prepared to take that risk to try that out?
That would be a tough risk to take. She's
exactly.
That would be difficult.
Exactly. So, and this is how your nervous system sees the world. The nervous system is like the parent. It's the guardian. It's the protector. It's surveying everything that you're doing, and it's watching for potential danger. So for those people who are doing 400 press-ups and they're just doing way too much, and they're saying, well, I've got all this muscle spasm, and things have gone tight. It's that the parent is pulling the reins on. We have to help them to reconceptualize this, not as damage or harm or a good thing, no pain, no gain type warrior approach, but instead see it as, well, what would you do as a parent if your kid goes to run into the road? Of course you'll stop them. Of course you'll protect. And, that's what's happening when you do way too much. There's just this biological, neurological, physiological response that's making things tighten up to protect you because you're doing way more than your body is wanting you to do, that's capable of doing. So I think that's maybe an example of how we can combine metaphor with a shared experience and to try and get people to maybe shift in their approach, their behavior.
No, that's great. I would love to hear, Mike, because obviously you train physios to do this. You train, I think, even maybe more than just physios, but I'd love to hear kind of a little bit about what you're up to coursework wise and kind of where folks can, if they're interested, which I'd highly recommend you consider taking one of Mike's courses. You did it at the San Diego Pain Summit. I was not able to do it. I remember it was one of my frustrating, couldn't make the logistics of travel and life work at that time. But for those of you who are thinking about or for those of our listeners, I should say, who are thinking about taking a course, where can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I love going to San Diego. It's a great summit. It really is. It's been, sadly, I've not been back to North America since COVID. I'm still sort of, so I'm more than happy to return back over. I have done some online teaching with people in Canada and across the States. So you can reach me at nopain.co.uk is the website, and that's KNOW. .co.uk. My email is mike@nopain.co.uk. But you'll discover on the website there's a range of live online courses that I teach, and you can join a range of colleagues. I teach, as you've highlighted, Mark, not just physios, but psychologists and doctors and nurses. So what I find really fascinating with the live online courses is that we get a mixture of professions from different parts of the world, from different cultures, as we started talking about. So we get to share some experiences and a bit of clinical companionship, which I think is always quite helpful. So I teach 2-day online courses. I teach physical face-to-face courses. I'm delighted to be going back to Australia to teach again next year. So there's some courses up on the website. Back into South America. I've recently returned from teaching in Peru, which was a great experience. So a range of face-to-face courses, old-fashioned traditional courses, and live online teaching as well. I'd like to suggest something. I mean, I don't know about you, Mark, but I find that I'm always one of these clinicians. I've always wanted to be a physio, but I'm always one of these clinicians who I feel not very good at my job. I constantly sort of sit of a nighttime going, I don't think I'm very good. Somebody else could do this a bit better. And I think a lot of that is to do with how complex what we do really is. So maybe I can finish by providing some help. I'm always looking for people who give me some solace and help me with this feeling of inadequacy, of not feeling good enough as a clinician. Somebody who really helped me was Professor Stephen Hawking, weirdly enough. I was listening to a podcast interview with Stephen Hawking, and the interviewer said to him, why did you not become a doctor? Your father was a medical doctor. Why did you not choose to become a medical doctor? And he said something that's always really interested me. He said, I realized from watching my dad with his patients that healthcare is far too chaotic. It's far too uncertain. It's far too unpredictable. So I decided to do an easier job. I decided to study black holes. So next time you're sitting there in clinic and you feel that you're not very good as a clinician, and I meet lots of clinicians who also feel like this, remember Stephen Hawking's reflection, his observation that you've chosen a job that he found too challenging. It's quite complex. Yeah. But in that complexity, you've got to keep it simple.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate that you sharing that, because I think it definitely encapsulates some of the challenges we face clinically, and then some of the challenges we face just existentially, as far as that imposter syndrome that we can all battle from time to time, as far as feeling, because we deal with complexity that's, as Stephen Hawking said, and retreated from it. It's sometimes, it can be challenging, can tax the emotions, tax the mental capacity, but such a fun challenge to have from day to day. And it sounds like you do. And it's definitely been something to me that exploring this creativity that you've talked about in the podcast has been a huge help for me. Kind of revitalized my career as far as excited to go to the clinic those days. The patients that are the ones that looked at it the most challenging, or the toughest patients, or the ones those are the most fun ones to me. I mean, not that they always go perfectly. I'm not going to go here and say that I'm a 100% success rate by any means, but it's just such a fun challenge to, how do I get into that narrative and see if I can kind of steer it in a different direction? Because it hasn't been going good for the last bit for those patients. So folks like yourself, I greatly appreciate it, because you've played a role in my ability to help folks in that journey, just reading a lot of your work. So thank you for a lot of the work you've done.
An absolute pleasure. And I hope people who are watching and listening find our chat helpful today.
Yes, for those of you listening, we'd love if you could jump on the podcast provider you have and subscribe, or if you're on YouTube, subscribe. That helps us get some of this information out to more physios and more patients who are watching the podcast. So thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. And we will talk to you next episode.